Something most people won't tell you right now, and certainly not the corporate media, is that what is unfolding this week between Washington and Europe is not a diplomatic spat, not a trade disagreement, not a policy difference. What we are watching in real time is the structural dismantling of an alliance that has defined the world order for the better part of 80 years. And if you think this is going to resolve itself with a phone call and a handshake, you have not been paying close enough attention to the deeper architecture of what is actually happening here. Because this is not about cars, this is not about troop numbers, this is about who controls the future of Western civilization, who pays for it, and what happens to the countries that refuse to fall in line. The decisions that landed this week all at once in rapid sequence are not random. They are a message, and the message is written in the language of power, not in the language of diplomacy. Just last week, President Trump announced a 25% tariff on all European cars and trucks entering the United States, citing what he called Europe's failure to comply with a trade deal that had already been agreed upon with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen last July. He posted it on Truth Social, casually, as if the unraveling of transatlantic trade were a minor administrative note. But let's think about what that actually means for a moment. The European auto industry, Germany's Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, Italy's Ferrari and Fiat, Sweden's Volvo, these are not just companies. These are the economic backbones of entire nations. When you hit a 25% tariff on those cars entering the American market, you are not merely inconveniencing executives in Stuttgart. You are sending a shockwave through the labor markets, through pension systems, through the tax bases of countries that are already struggling with deindustrialization and energy costs, that went through the roof after the Ukraine conflict. You are, in a very real sense, reaching across the Atlantic and squeezing. Trump framed the tariff hike as part of a broader push to rebalance trade and boost domestic manufacturing, boasting about over $100 billion in investment and plant construction already underway in the United States. And look, there is a legitimate argument to be made about trade imbalances. There is a legitimate conversation to be had about whether America has subsidized European prosperity for decades, while its own industrial base quietly rusted out. That conversation deserves to be had honestly. But here's the thing that the mainstream commentators keep missing. The timing of this announcement was not coincidental. It did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived at the exact same moment as the troop withdrawal from Germany. It arrived alongside the weapons delays, and that coordination is the entire story. Trump's anger at his European allies stems directly from the Iran war. When Europe declined to send warships to help open the Strait of Hormuz, Trump called NATO useless and cowards, and has since been systematically trying to punish his European allies for that refusal. Now I want you to sit with that for a moment. The United States and Israel launched a war against Iran beginning in late February of this year, and Washington expected its NATO partners to show up. Germany declined. Spain declined. Italy declined. France kept its distance. And in Trump's world, that refusal constituted a betrayal so complete, so fundamental, that it now justifies a wholesale restructuring of the American commitment to European defense. Whether you agree with that logic or not, whether you think the Iran war was justified or not, that is the actual chain of events that produced this week's avalanche of decisions. The Pentagon announced plans to pull around 5,000 troops from Germany, with the withdrawal expected to be completed over the next 6 to 12 months. The stated rationale was a thorough review of the department's force posture in Europe, reflecting theater requirements and conditions on the ground. Now, 5,000 troops out of approximately 36,000 sounds modest. Some German officials tried to spin it exactly that way. Boris Pistorius, Germany's defense minister, said the move was anticipated and tried to project calm. But Trump himself, speaking to reporters in Florida on Saturday, made absolutely clear that 5,000 was just the opening move. "We're going to cut way down," he said, "and we're cutting a lot further than 5,000. That is not a measured drawdown. That is a signal. That is a president telling you that the numbers you see today are not the final numbers, and that the direction of travel is unmistakably away from Europe. And now think about what this means for the eastern flank of NATO. Think about Poland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, countries that have spent the last 4 years dramatically increasing their defense budgets precisely because they believed the American umbrella would remain open above them. Republican lawmakers on the Armed Services Committee, including Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi and Representative Mike Rogers of Alabama, released a statement saying they were very concerned about the troop withdrawal, warning it risked undermining deterrence and sending the wrong signal to Vladimir Putin. This is not Democrats raising alarm. These are Republicans. Members of Trump's own party, people who sit on the Armed Services Committee and understand exactly what American forward deployment means for deterrence in Eastern Europe, and they are worried. That ought to tell you something. Beyond the troops, the Pentagon also decided to cancel the planned deployment of the Army's Long-Range Fires Battalion, which was supposed to bring Tomahawk and hypersonic missiles to Germany. That battalion was specifically designed to give NATO a forward-based deterrent capability against the kind of ballistic missile threat that Russia presents. Its cancellation means that the deterrent architecture that European governments were counting on is now gone, not delayed, gone, and replaced with a demand that Europe figure out its own deterrent posture. Now Europe can eventually do that. European defense annual spending is projected to nearly double by 2030, reaching close to $750 billion. But the gap between where European defense production stands today and where it needs to be is not a gap that closes in 18 months. It is a decade-long problem. And in that decade-long gap, there is significant exposure. At the same time as the drawdown, the Pentagon notified NATO allies across Europe to expect weapons delays as the United States works to replenish its own weapons stockpiles burned through during the Iran war. And we need to really understand what those stockpiles look like right now because the scale of the depletion is staggering. The Pentagon has warned European allies, including the United Kingdom, Poland, Lithuania, and Estonia, of long delays in deliveries of HIMARS and NASAMS systems as it scrambles to replenish stockpiles depleted by the Iran campaign, according to the Financial Times, citing 9 people familiar with the matter. HIMARS, the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, is the same weapons platform that transformed the battlefield in Ukraine. It is what gave Ukrainian forces the ability to strike Russian logistics deep behind the front lines. NASAMS, the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, is one of the most capable medium-range air defense platforms that European countries use to protect their airspace. Both are now delayed. Both are now backlogged, and the reason is not production failure. The reason is that the Iran war burned through American reserves at a pace that has left the Pentagon in a genuinely difficult position. Tom Wright, a former official in the Biden administration now at the Brookings Institution, put it starkly, "The Pentagon may now need to fight a long war in the Middle East, and it's also desperate to shore up deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. It's more than willing to throw Europe under the bus to do that." Throw Europe under the bus? That is a former American official at one of the most respected think tanks in Washington using that exact phrase, not a foreign critic, not a Russian propagandist, an American analyst at Brookings. And he is saying out loud what a lot of people in Washington corridors have been whispering for months, that Europe has quietly slipped in the hierarchy of American strategic priorities. Asia is the priority, the Middle East is the priority, and Europe, which spent decades enjoying the American security umbrella while running trade surpluses and keeping its own defense spending low, is now being handed the bill for that arrangement all at once. Trump threatened he would probably pull back troops from Spain and Italy too. Why shouldn't I? Italy has not been of any help to us, and Spain has been horrible, absolutely horrible, he told reporters at the White House. Spain denied the US military permission to use its airspace or its bases for strikes linked to the Iran conflict, a sovereign decision that Trump is now treating as a justification for restructuring the American military presence in the Iberian Peninsula. And the internal Pentagon documents, which were leaked and widely reported, showed that the Department of Defense was even floating the idea of suspending Spain from NATO and reviewing American diplomatic support for European nations' imperial possessions, including the Falkland Islands. Let that land for a moment. The United States military, under this administration, was literally discussing whether to remove a NATO ally from the alliance as a form of punishment for not supporting a war that most of Europe never voted to join. Now here is where the analysis has to go deeper, because what we are watching is not simply Trump being impulsive. Trump is always described as impulsive, as erratic, as unpredictable, and that framing, while sometimes useful, actually prevents people from seeing the structural logic that sits underneath these decisions. The structural logic is this: the United States has concluded at the highest levels of its strategic establishment that it can no longer simultaneously maintain its commitments to Europe, prosecute a war in the Middle East, deter China in the Pacific, and pay for it all while running the deficits it is running. Something has to give. And Europe, which has been the most comfortable dependent in the American security architecture, is the thing that is giving. The tariffs, the troops, the weapons delays, these are not 3 separate decisions. They are three prongs of a single coherent strategy to force Europe to pay its own way and accept a diminished role in American strategic planning. The 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, passed by the Senate last year, actually includes a provision that bars U.S. troop levels in Europe from being permanently reduced below 75,000. So Trump's ability to follow through on his most dramatic threats is legally constrained. Congress can push back. And in fact, Republican leaders of both armed services committees in Congress said they were very concerned and that the decision risked undermining deterrence and sending the wrong signal to Vladimir Putin. But the president is clearly operating at the edge of those constraints and beyond, and the question of whether Congress will actually stop him or whether the political will exists to draw a hard line remains genuinely open. What this creates for Europe is a crisis not just of defense, but of identity. For 80 years, the European project has been built on an assumption that American power underwrites European peace, that NATO is permanent, that the security umbrella does not get folded up and taken away because the Europeans chose not to join a war in Tehran. The entire architecture of European foreign policy, European defense planning, European political consensus, it all rests on that foundation. And right now, that foundation is cracking in ways that cannot be plastered over with a summit communiqué. A NATO spokesperson said the latest US moves underscore the need for Europe to invest more in defense, while a senior Pentagon official, Elbridge Colby, stated that Washington wants to focus on challenges where only American power can play a decisive role, specifically in Asia and the Western Hemisphere. Elbridge Colby is not a fringe voice. He is one of the most respected and influential strategic thinkers to come out of the American defense establishment in the last decade, and his framework, which prioritizes Asia above everything, treats Europe as a secondary theater, and demands that European nations carry their own weight, is now the operational philosophy of the Pentagon. That is the reality. That is the strategic doctrine under which these decisions are being made. And what about Ukraine in all of this? Ukraine was already facing a shortage of US-made Patriot air defense systems, the $4 million per interceptor munitions it uses to shoot down ballistic missiles and drones. The new weapons delays will compound existing shortages of HIMARS and NASAMS munitions used on the front lines. Ukraine is fighting a war against Russia right now, using American weapon systems that are now being delayed because those same systems were burned through in Iran. Think about the strategic irony of that situation. The United States spent years building Ukraine into a forward-deployed hedge against Russian power in Europe. And now the weapons pipeline that sustains that hedge is being diverted to replenish stockpiles used in a completely separate conflict in the Middle East, while simultaneously the United States is withdrawing troops from the European theater and telling its allies to expect less. The interconnectedness of these crises, Iran, Ukraine, NATO cohesion, European defense autonomy, and American strategic reorientation toward Asia, is exactly what makes this moment so historically significant. Analysts describe a staggering burn rate of missile defense interceptors, such as Patriots and THAADs in the Gulf conflict, with the US set to send Gulf allies more weapons worth several $billions, billions to the Gulf, delays to Europe, withdrawals from Germany, tariffs on French wine and German cars. This is the ledger. And if you are a policymaker in Warsaw, in Tallinn, in Vilnius, or in Kiev, looking at that ledger right now, you are asking yourself a question that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. What does European security look like in a world where American protection is no longer guaranteed? The answer Europe is beginning to piece together is uncomfortable. European manufacturers produce varying missile interceptors, but not at scale, and especially not those capable of countering ballistic and advanced cruise missiles. They do not offer a single full substitute for US systems, according to a recent study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Europe makes 12 different main battle tanks. America makes one. Europe's defense procurement is fragmented, nationalistic, and expensive precisely because for decades it did not have to be otherwise. The American umbrella allowed European nations to focus on social spending, on infrastructure, on the quality of life indicators that made European cities the envy of the world. That era is over. The bill for it is arriving now, and it is arriving in the form of a 25% tariff on your cars, a phone call telling you your weapons shipment is delayed, and a presidential tweet saying that the troops are leaving and cutting a lot further than 5,000. What Americans need to understand, what people who are following geopolitics seriously, who care about war and peace, who want to understand what the world is actually becoming, is that this is not a story about one president's temperament. This is a story about a structural shift in the global order that was always going to come, that has been building for 2 decades, and that is now arriving with sudden, jarring speed. The unipolar moment, the post-Cold War era in which American power was so overwhelming that it could simultaneously guarantee European security, fight wars in the Middle East, deter China, and run a current account deficit of this magnitude, that moment has passed. And the decisions you are watching this week are what the end of that moment actually looks like in practice. It looks like tariffs, it looks like empty barracks, it looks like a phone call from the Pentagon saying your HIMARS ammunition is going to be late. The question that history will ask, the question that we should be asking right now today, while there is still time to shape the answer, is not whether this shift was avoidable. It probably was not. The question is whether the institutions that govern the Western world, from NATO to the European Union to the transatlantic trading relationship, are capable of managing this transition without catastrophic rupture. Because right now, looking at the evidence in front of us, the answer to that question is far from certain, and the stakes for getting it wrong are not abstract. They are measured in the security of nations, in the lives of soldiers, in the fate of a war that is still being fought on European soil, and in the shape of the world that your children and grandchildren are going to inherit.